Welcome back to the Long View, everyone. I am delighted to be here with Rick Loessberg, who is the author of Two Societies, The Rioting of 1967 and The Writing of the Kerner Report, an incredibly important subject with a lot of insight into that moment. Rick, thanks for joining the Long View.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start. I assume many people don't know what the Kerner Report is. So can you tell us what happened in the summer of 67 that led to the report and basically what was the report set up to do?
Well, in 1967, there was a massive wave of rioting across the United States. It was in the black neighborhoods of over 150 cities. And it didn't matter where you were or how large or how small the city was, you seemed to be prone to this violence. It was Tampa to Boston to Tucson to even Omaha. And of course, there was Newark and Detroit, which everybody seems to remember. It really seemed like we were about to have open warfare between blacks and whites. Responding to the situation, President Johnson created a special committee, had 11 individuals. It became known as the Kerner Commission because its chairman was the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner. And he charged them with the task of trying to figure out what was happening, why, and then what could be done to prevent it from reoccurring. 7 months later, they presented a report that frankly shocked almost everyone. There were those who thought it was going to be the typical whitewash and blamed the rioting on a handful of losers and drifters and riffraff, as the term was, because that's basically what had been happened in all other previous riot reports, whether it was Watts, whether it was 1933 Harlem, whether it was 1943 Detroit. That was always the conclusion. Or you expected it to be, well, there was a conspiracy. It was the communists, it was the radicals, it was Stokely Carmichael. Well, it turned out that the commission found that it was neither of those two. Instead, it found that it was basically the people who lived in the neighborhood themselves. They had analyzed the arrest records of almost 14,000 people who had been arrested in 22 of the riots, and they discovered these were people who had actually had, on the average, more education than their typical neighbor, had a job, were lifelong residents. They weren't drifters. They weren't losers. In fact, you could argue they were actually playing the game, trying to get ahead, staying in school, working hard, and yet something caused them to think, what's the point anymore? And so what happened, the commission then concluded that it was decades of pervasive discrimination and segregation, and this was a reaction to it all. And they famously warned the nation that despite all the advances of the last several years, the nation was still moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal.
And other than Kerner, who heads the commission, what are some of the other types of people? Who are some of the other people who Johnson puts on this commission?
Well, a lot of the people who were on there were typical mainstream establishment politicians. In fact, for people who were more liberally inclined, they thought, again, the deck is stacked. We know what they're going to conclude. It was Fred Harris, a senator from Oklahoma. You had William McCullough, who, while he was the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee and was a firm supporter of civil rights, in fact, you can make the argument that he probably had more to do with the 1964 Civil Rights Act than anyone in Congress. He was from a small, Midwestern town in Ohio, whereas only 2% of the population was black. You had a labor union leader, I.W. Abel, who was head of a labor union that was regarded as being one of the most discriminatory labor unions. Yes, you had Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, but everybody else, people that most of the America did not know who they were. And so no one expected a report that was as bold and as remarkable as the one that came out.
And there's a draft report or a draft study that ultimately doesn't come out. And it's a fascinating story that you talk about. Can you tell us more about what was in it and why it was jettisoned?
Well, if you go back to the 1960s, that was sort of the beginning of what you could say modern political science and modern public policy analysis. We were going to use social sciences and we were going to use computers and we were going to find the answers to all of our problems, whether it was juvenile delinquency or poverty or how to fight a war in Southeast Asia. That's what we were going to do. The commission had a staff of social scientists. They were asked to try to figure out what was going on. The commission sent out 22 field teams throughout the United States. And they spent on the average about a week in every city, and they interviewed, yes, the police chief and the mayor and all that sort of thing. But then they actually walked the streets and talked to people who lived in the neighborhoods where the riots had been. They actually commissioned special public opinion polling so they could actually find out what it was that the people in those neighborhoods thought. They put together something like 20,000 pages of data. Then these social scientists went back and tried to analyze it, interpret it. And what they found was ultimately what the commission itself recommended and found was that it was discrimination. It was a reaction to discrimination. The wording they used in their draft report, though, to put it bluntly, was inflammatory. All the social scientists, with the exception of their leader, were all in their 20s. And again, we're talking 1967. It was the spirit of the times. It was very much power to the people sort of interpretation of it. Uh, they were under enormous pressure to get this report done because it was supposed to serve as basically as senior staff as well as the social scientists who were responsible for it. It's supposed to be the guts of the report. The entire report was supposed to revolve around this paper that was going to be basically the second chapter of the report. Because of the language, it was not well received. And there's all kinds of mythology that has grown up around it. It also coincided with a time when the commission suddenly was informed that instead of having all the resources that it would need, what President Johnson had once told them, they basically had 120 days to wrap everything up. So they immediately had to start laying off people. And one of the first groups of people who got laid off were the social scientists and their field team of researchers. So, of course, for those people who wrote the report, they're thinking it's retribution. We're being punished for what we wrote, as opposed to it being, we've just run out of time, and what you gave us was not what we were really looking for. And so they felt like, senior staff felt like, we don't have time to give them another 90 days or another 30 days even to rewrite the report. So they set it aside. Now, when you actually go back and you look at the major parts of this report or of the paper, it's called The Harvest of American Racism. You see the major themes are what ultimately is in the final report of the Kerner Commission. And it's that the police were the instigator or the spark for so many of the disturbances, that it's widespread discrimination that people are reacting to. So that's really what came out of Harvest. And to the social scientists' credit, when I went back and started talking to them 5-8 years ago, they all said, yeah, we really had our feelings hurt in 1967 and 68, but the report really had what we wanted, and the report was still an advancement over what had previously been recorded in the literature.
And how did it's a bold report? The press picks up on it, and they talk about white racism, which is seen as a pretty dramatic thing to see in print at that time from a government report.
Yep.
How did the commission kind of decide to go bold in talking about policing, unemployment, and even the media itself being critical of the lack of diversity in the newsroom? Was there a driver in the commission? Did it organically just
There
reach the
were
conclusion?
there were a couple of personalities who drove the discussion. John Lindsay, who was the mayor of New York, he was the vice chairman of the commission, and was one of the few figures on the commission that had a national reputation. The other, ironically, was Fred Harris from Oklahoma. But really, what I think caused the commission to reach the conclusions that they did was, again, to their credit, they went out to the cities themselves. Each of them went to at least 3 cities, if not 5 cities, and they walked the streets. And yes, they'd be part of an official delegation with the mayor and the police chief and all that. But then they would also break away, and sometimes they would show up unannounced, and they would walk the streets and talk to people standing on the corner or go into the proverbial barber shop and ask them what was going on. They all talk about what they were shocked by, what they saw. And the classic line that I always remember is one from Otto Kerner. Otto Kerner was from Chicago. He's the governor of Illinois. And he talks about, I admit I'm a city boy, but I was shocked by what I saw. And then it even goes down to the more conservative members of the commission, like Charles Tex Thornton, who was from West Texas. And he was clearly the most conservative member of the commission. And he admits, and these are the words that he uses, his position changed 180 degrees by what he saw. And what they saw were things like a vacant lot with weeds and broken bottles. That's passing for a city park. And then they go to talk to the mayor about this, and they go, well, we don't think we have a problem. And the riots, it's only because, our black people are nice people. It's just a handful of people. And the more of the discussions they had, the more defensive the city officials got. And to the commission, it was clear what was happening. It really was two societies, and they saw it, not just physically, but also symbolically and rhetorically.
And what was some of the response, both critical and in terms of praise, that the commission received once this report becomes public in 1968?
Well, what's interesting is a lot of people were initially shocked by, again, the boldness of it because no one was expecting it. Like I said, a lot of liberals were convinced it was going to be a whitewash, and it clearly was not. What some of the criticisms of it were that in blaming society, they blamed society as a whole, but not the actual people who'd done the rioting. And that really bothered a lot of people. They also, because they blamed white racism, they unfortunately didn't give really good examples of what they meant by that. You got to remember, going back in 1967, 68, we're just a handful of years away from when the Klan is blowing up churches in Birmingham, when acts of discrimination were not only overt, but very harsh and very violent. And so when you call those racist, you understand that. I don't think anybody doubts that. But when you have other forms of racism that we now know exist that are much more subtle and nuanced and maybe unintentional, but they didn't give examples of that. And so when they see these accusations that whites or white society and institutions are racist, they're accusing me of being a Klans member. That didn't go over well. The other thing that also got severe pushback were the ambitious and massive recommendations that the report made. Uh, you have to go back to 1967, 68. OBJ's desperately trying to fight both a domestic war on poverty and a war in Vietnam. And he's running out of money for both. And he's trying to maintain the status quo. And here comes a report that many people have interpreted as saying you need to now spend as much money on the cities as you're already spending on Vietnam. And Johnson had just already done what we would now regard as unprecedented and political suicide by asking for a temporary increase in the income tax just to finance what was already happening. There was a great quote from George Mahan, who was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, and he says that the 600 pages of findings and recommendations can be summed up in 3 words: spend more money.
Before I get to my final questions, I want to thank all the subscribers listening now and listening when I send this out. It's a pleasure to have you on the Long View, and I hope you can consider a paid subscription to the Long View to support these kinds of conversations. What brought you to write about the Kerner Commission at this point in your career? What was the kind of motivation for you of tackling this project?
It's been a long story, Julian. I was 10 when the riots happened in 67. And I came from a family where we subscribed to, not only did you have newspapers then, but you had a morning paper and an evening paper. And we subscribed to Life magazine and Business Week. And my parents always watched the evening news. So I'm watching the evening news with them, and I'm seeing these scenes where there's tanks rolling down American streets and soldiers hiding behind parked cars shooting guns. And it looked like a scene from a World War II movie. And I'm aware, while I'm 10, I'm aware that we are trying to do this war on poverty and trying to help poor people, which resonated with me because my parents were very much children of the Great Depression. And my mom's family, for instance, was financially wiped out and the family fragmented. And my mom had to go live with relatives from when she was like 4 until she was 11 before she got to live back at home with her mom and her sister. So poverty was a very real thing for me. The other was that my dad was worked for the Ford Motor Company for about 30 years. So I knew that Detroit was where my dad's paycheck came from. And while I had never been there, it was a very real place for me. So I'm watching this unfold. I'm wondering, something's wrong, but I don't get it. You fast forward 10 years, I'm in college, and one of the textbooks that we used for the American government class I took, a chapter was the summary from the Kerner Report. And it prefaces this chapter saying this was a very controversial report and generally wasn't adopted, which is the common, that's what most people say. I will argue that a lot of the report has been recommended, not at the scope and at the pace that the commission thought, but it has been recommended. So I didn't find out about this report for the first time, and I go, I wonder what happened to it. You fast forward a few more years, I'm in graduate school, and I decide I'm going to do my master's thesis on the Kerner Report, which I did. I then started my career in local government. And as I began my career, I began to have an appreciation for what the Kerner Commission and its staff did. They wrote a 600-page report in 7 months. And this is back in the days when you don't have laptops and you don't have cell phones. They did meeting notices by sending telegrams out. It was very quaint. And they literally wrote the report and the drafts with scotch tape, scissors, and little bottles of liquid paper. And that's how they wrote all the drafts of it. And having eventually served on special committees in my job, or staff special committees, or develop an understanding of how hard it is to get consensus on a variety of issues, let alone one as difficult as race, it was a topic I could just never let go. And I just always needed to know more about it. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized how relevant it remains. It's almost 60 years old, but it doesn't take anybody very long to thumb through the 600 pages to realize everything it's talking about is what we're talking about today. The hysteria over DEI, believing that the Smithsonian focuses too much on the bad of slavery, now deploying the National Guard and what the consequences of that might be. It seems the farther we get away from 1968, the closer we're still getting back to the Kerner Report.
And I'll just add to that that it's worth people reading the report and seeing what it says on policing, which dealing with very similar issues to this day, and it's very haunting to read that often, given how long ago that was and how many problems remain unaddressed. Anyway, thank you for joining. Rick Loessberg, Two Societies, The Rioting of 1967 and the Writing of the Kerner Report. Really an important book, and I'm glad you put it out there, and I'm glad we could have this discussion. Thanks for joining the Long View.
Thank you, Julian.
Bye-bye.